Eruption 15. The Left Coast? So after the big three-parter over the last few weeks, I think something shorter and more free-form is in order for this episode. We've already had an overview of the political situation of the three new nations. However, I want to go a little more in-depth specifically into the left wing of the new countries and relations with the Chinese and the Soviets. Neither of these topics are straightforward, and they merit additional discussion. To start, it is worth reiterating that all three of the new nations are still fundamentally neoliberal capitalist democracies. While they are all fairly progressive when it comes to social issues, when it comes to economics, the free market still reigns supreme. The vast majority of the population still views communism negatively and are still skeptical of any political movement left of FDR. The collapse of the USA during the eruption, from the West Coast perspective, was not inherently a failure of capitalism, and it certainly didn't overwrite decades of anti-communist propaganda from the USA prior to the eruption. The failure of the USA was pinned almost entirely on Reagan and the federal government, not as a systemic failure of capitalism itself. In fact, fear of a potential Soviet attack and worry that the USA would not be able to protect them was one of the many factors that caused many citizens of the West Coast to be supportive of the revolutionary governments. If the U.S. government wasn't going to protect them, then they would stand behind state governments who would. Certainly, the soldiers and sailors who led the San Diego naval mutiny hadn't suddenly become communists. Lack of confidence in the chain of command didn't equal a revolutionary awakening. Even the Chinese and Soviets supporting their secession and the Western Revolution was not enough to sway most people's opinions throughout the rest of the 80s and the early 90s. The spirit of the Western Revolution was that of rugged individualism and pursuit of liberty, and not some sudden emergence of class consciousness. As we've touched on before, the partial collapse of both the USA and the USSR at the end of the Cold War was viewed as more of a failure of the idea of superpowers and the political inflexibility that came with rigid commitment to a single political philosophy. While communism wasn't necessarily viewed as a failed philosophy in the West, as it is in the real world, the idea of latching on to one political theory in its entirety would be seen as problematic. By the end of the 90s, this would manifest in the rise of center-left political parties, such as the Democratic Socialists in California and Cascadia, and the Green Party in Cascadia and Hawaii. The right-wing parties on the West Coast would also be rocked by several scandals involving alleged ties to the American GOP during this time. While ultimately untrue, these rumors were enough to force the right-wing parties to rebrand themselves as libertarians and adopt more centrist positions to disassociate themselves from the USA. This led to a shift in the Overton window in the three nations of the West Coast, slightly to the left. Social democracy and the welfare state were no longer fringe theories to most people and had become part of the political discussion. The rise of the center-left would be followed up with a subsequent rise of more far-left political philosophies in the late 2000s. This is largely attributed to two factors: millennials reaching voting age and an economic downturn near the end of the decade. The millennials were the first generation that would have been born and lived their entire lives post-eruption. They would have had no exposure to American anti-left-wing propaganda, and on the contrary, would have grown up hearing about how the U.S. had failed the West Coast after Yellowstone, from school, the media, and even their parents. The U.S. was the great evil in the world in their eyes, in contrast to the Eastern Bloc, which hadn't directly threatened them. In a very "the enemy of my enemy is my friend" kind of way, many young people would have a fairly positive view of the Soviets in particular. The Chinese would still be viewed with some skepticism due to their attack on Taiwan. Evidently, the atrocities of Stalin were far enough in the past that they could be overlooked or swept into the dustbin of history. Regardless, an economic downturn starting around 2006 would be blamed on U.S. military action in the Middle East. Recall that a 9/11 type attack would still occur around 2001, as well as unchecked and reckless banking practices. There was also much anxiety among the younger generation around the influence and business practices of the tech companies of the West Coast, which led them to generally support organized labor. The result was many young Californians, Cascadians, and Hawaiians supporting left-wing parties like the Cascadian Workers' Party and the Californian Labor Front. These movements would have limited electoral success, but again, it would shift the envelope of acceptable political discussion more to the left, and consequently, the center-left political parties would sweep elections in all three nations in the latter part of the decade. Across the eruption zone, economic anxiety conversely led to the rise of the far right in the form of the Manifest Destiny Party. They used the rise of the left on the West Coast to instill fear of an impending communist takeover. This was the dog whistle that the right wing had been waiting for, a chance to fulfill their Red Dawn fantasy and take the fight to the Reds. Again, the response from the West Coast was largely bemusement, as no such communist takeover had occurred, and they were still very much living in a free market society. Yet, the MDP was able to rile up the American people enough that after merging with the GOP, they won the presidency in 2016. This led to a strange phenomenon, wherein because leftists on the West Coast got called communists all the time, they actually started believing that they were, even if the political philosophies they were promoting weren't actually communism. There are many occasions where these leftists would end up meeting with a fellow traveler from China, Vietnam, or the USSR, who after some discussion would politely inform them that what they were advocating was more of something like market socialism or even syndicalism than it was communism, and that they themselves had moved on from such a strict interpretation of Marxism. At which point, the leftist would respond, "Well, everyone I've ever met has said I'm a communist." They ended up believing the American propaganda saying that the West Coast was overrun by commies, and actually came to embrace it. Red flags, hammer and sickles, and propaganda posters from the USSR became common imagery in leftist circles on the West Coast. Again, when dignitaries from said Eastern Bloc would visit the West Coast, they would find this rather incredulous and even slightly upsetting, as their home countries had since moved on from this hard-line interpretation of Marxism, and they didn't want to be reminded of the hardships of the past. The West Coast and the communist nations had a working relationship from the very beginning. The PRC and the USSR, along with their client states, recognized that all three nations almost immediately after they declared independence. They set about establishing official diplomatic relations with the provisional governments and made the case to the UN General Assembly that they should immediately be granted observer status. Of course, they were also entirely aware that the new nations were certainly not socialist by any stretch of the imagination, and that was unlikely to change anytime soon. Their support of the West Coast was purely an exercise in frustrating the United States. Likewise, the West Coast graciously accepted their support, but was also careful to frame in it the context of promoting global peace and ending the Cold War, rather than a shift to the political left. As 1986 came to a close, the failed harvest led to unrest in the USSR, which forced them to largely retreat from global affairs while they dealt with the crisis. The PRC also became more insular in the lead-up to their failed 1988 invasion of Taiwan. This attack on one of the West Coast's closest allies would ruin relations between the nations for the next decade or so. Both sides would largely remain focused on their own internal and regional affairs throughout the rest of the 80s and the 90s. It's almost certain that the Eastern Bloc was attempting to gather intelligence and perhaps engaging in some minor acts of subterfuge against the West Coast. However, they knew that the population still had very little interest in leftist ideals, so they generally didn't waste their time. By the time both the USSR and the PRC were willing and able to get involved with global politics again, their economies had opened up, and they had shifted to more of a soft power approach that didn't involve directly interfering with the internal politics of other nations. The Cold War was over. The PRC would eventually open up its vast manufacturing potential to Western companies, which the tech giants of the West Coast would gladly take advantage of. They were quick to forget Taiwan when there was profit on the line. The USSR would also begin selling its mineral and petrochemical exports on the open market, which again would be purchased by Western corporations. The Cascadians and the Soviets would actually broker a deal in the early 90s for the lease of a batch of Mi-35 and Mi-8 attack helicopters as a stopgap while the AH-66 Comanche was in development. The Californians also tested Soviet AK-101 and Chinese QBZ-97 rifles during their rifle trials in the 90s. However, neither design was chosen. The Cascadians subsequently importing Saab Gripen NG fighters and the Californians acquiring CZ-805 rifles in the 2000s was seen as a deliberate attempt to move away from Soviet and Chinese influence, and instead build relationships with the other democracies in Europe. The two sides would continue to have a largely cordial and business-forward relationship as the new millennium began. The major outlier was Vietnam, whose long rivalry with the Chinese and war with the US brought them closer to the West Coast. Refer to Part 7 for the full story on that. Politicians from the West Coast would often refer to the Eastern Bloc as our longtime business partners, or some other non-committal term like that. And likewise, leaders in the East would often say things like, our friends across the sea, always keeping each other at an arm's length, but still leaving the door open for future business dealings. The American election of a far-right government in 2016 obviously made the Eastern Bloc uneasy. The right wing's ire being directed towards the West Coast at the present time gave them some breathing room for the moment, yet they knew the situation could spiral at any moment. The premiers of the PRC, Vietnam, and the USSR issued a joint statement at a conference in Beijing in January 2017. The rise of violent and imperialist rhetoric from the United States is deeply concerning to us. The world must prepare to stand together in the face of tyranny and aggression unless we wish to be dragged into another worldwide conflict. We stand with the workers and free peoples of the West Coast. We hope that cooler heads will prevail, yet we stand ready to defend peace, justice, and freedom the world over. Until next time.